before the fire went out. That's when the best stories were told. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Folklore Crypt. It helps keep these stories alive and brings more folklore to your nights. And tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing when and where around the world these stories find you. Welcome. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Tonight we journey to the ancient Yoruba kingdoms of what is now Nigeria. To a time when iron was not just metal but sacred material. When blacksmiths were not just craftsmen but spiritual intermediaries. When the forge fire burned with more than heat, it burned with the presence of forces older than kingdoms. Older than memory. This is a story about power. About the terrible cost of disrespecting what should be honored. About a curse that fell upon an entire craft. A curse so complete, so devastating that even today, centuries later, those who work with iron carry its weight in ways they may not fully understand. It's a story about boundaries. About the line between human ambition and spiritual law. About what happens when that line is crossed. About generations who paid for sins they didn't commit. About knowledge that came too late to save those who needed it most. Let your breathing slow. Let the rhythm of the forge carry you back. Let yourself feel the heat of sacred fire. Let these old warnings speak. We begin not with the curse but with the gift. Because iron in the beginning was never meant to be cursed. It was meant to be blessed. In the time before iron, the Yoruba people worked with stone and wood and bone. These materials served them well enough. They built homes, made tools, hunted, survived. But there were limits to what stone and wood could do. Limits to how sharp a blade could be. How strong a tool. How effective a weapon. The people looked at these limits and prayed for something more. Something stronger. Something that could transform their world. Their prayers reached the Orishas, the divine forces that shaped existence, that governed everything from thunder to rivers to the space between heartbeats. One Orisha heard these prayers more clearly than others. His name was Ogun, the Lord of Iron, of labor, of technology, of the cutting edge that separates civilization from wilderness. Ogun was powerful, ancient, terrible in his strength, but also protective of those who honored him properly. He saw the Yoruba people struggling with their limited materials, saw their genuine need, saw their prayers as sincere rather than greedy. So Ogun made a decision. He would give them iron, would teach them to work with this sacred metal, would transform their world through his gift. But gifts from the Orishas always came with conditions, always required proper respect, always demanded that boundaries be maintained. Ogun descended to the earthly realm, not in full divine form, that would have destroyed everything around him, but in a form humans could perceive without going mad. He appeared as a massive man, dark as the deepest earth, muscular from eternal labor, carrying tools that hummed with power. He gathered the people, spoke in a voice like metal striking metal. I have heard your prayers. I will give you iron. Will teach you to find it in the earth, to heat it, to shape it, to create tools and weapons that will change everything. The people rejoiced, fell to their knees in gratitude. But Ogun raised his hand for silence. This gift comes with laws, sacred laws. Break them and you break the connection between iron and blessing. Break them and iron will turn against you, against your children, against all who follow your craft. The people listened carefully, understanding that divine gifts required divine respect. Ogun outlined the laws. There were 7 of them, each crucial, each designed to maintain the sacred relationship between humans and iron. First law: iron must never be worked on sacred days. The forge must rest when the Orishas rest. To work metal on these days is to treat the divine as secondary to human desire. Second law: blood must never be spilled on the forge. The fire that transforms iron is sacred. To contaminate it with violence is to corrupt the transformation itself. Third law. Women in their moon time must not approach the forge. Not from disrespect but from recognition that two different sacred powers should not mix. The creative power of potential life and the transformative power of iron belong to different spiritual domains. Fourth law. The first piece created each day must be offered to Ogun. A reminder that all skill comes from divine source. That the craftsman is intermediary, not origin. Fifth law. Secrets of the forge must be taught only to those properly initiated. Not to hoard knowledge but to ensure that those who work with sacred material understand its spiritual dimension. Teaching technique without teaching respect creates danger. Sixth law. The forge must be blessed regularly. Iron draws not just human attention but spiritual attention. Some spirits are helpful, others harmful. Regular blessing maintains proper spiritual environment. Seventh law. Pride must never enter the forge. The moment a smith believes their skill comes from themselves alone rather than from partnership with Ogun, the sacred connection breaks. The work becomes merely technical rather than transformative. These laws seemed reasonable. The people agreed readily, eager to receive this gift, eager to begin working with iron. Ogun showed them where to find iron ore, how to recognize it in rock and soil, how to extract it, how to build a forge hot enough to transform solid ore into workable metal. He taught them to strike heated iron, to fold it, to shape it into tools and weapons of incredible strength and sharpness. The first blacksmith was a man named Joseph. He had been chosen by the elders, had been tested for patience and humility and strength, had shown proper reverence for the sacred. Joseph learned directly from Ogun, spent months at the divine forge, mastered not just the technical aspects but the spiritual ones, learned to pray while working, to maintain awareness of the sacred even in the mundane act of striking metal. When Joseph returned to his people, he carried knowledge that would transform their world. He built the first human forge, blessed it according to Ogun's instructions, began creating iron tools. The results were miraculous. Iron axes that could fell trees stone axes couldn't scratch. Iron hoes that turned soil with tools barely dented. Iron weapons sharper than anything made from stone or bone. The Yoruba people's world changed overnight. Agriculture became more efficient. Building became faster. Defense became more effective. Trade expanded as other peoples sought Yoruba iron. Joseph taught others, but carefully. Only those who showed proper reverence. Only those who understood the spiritual dimension. Only those who could maintain the 7 laws. For 3 generations the laws were kept. The forge remained sacred. Iron continued to be blessing rather than curse. The relationship between Ogun and his craftsmen remained strong. Blacksmiths were honored in Yoruba society, treated as spiritual intermediaries, given respect due to those who worked with sacred forces. They lived well. Their children prospered. Their knowledge was valued. But prosperity has a way of breeding complacency. Success has a way of eroding caution. And the 4th generation produced a smith who would break everything. His name was Marcus. He was Joseph's great-great-grandson, born into the craft, raised at the forge, trained from childhood in both technique and tradition. Marcus was talented, exceptionally so. By 15 he could create ironwork that rivaled smiths twice his age. By 20 he was the most skilled craftsman in his region. By 25, his work was sought throughout the Yoruba kingdoms. This talent should have been blessing, but it became curse. Because talent without humility is just pride wearing a mask. Marcus began to believe his skill came from himself, from his hands, from his intelligence and practice and dedication. The role of Ogun became in his mind merely traditional. symbolic rather than real. He still performed the rituals, but mechanically, without genuine reverence, going through motions to maintain appearance while internally dismissing their importance. He still blessed the forge, but perfunctorily, rushing through prayers to get to the real work. He still made offerings, but grudgingly, viewing them as waste of good iron that could be sold. The elders noticed this shift, warned him, reminded him of the laws, of the importance of maintaining proper relationship with Ogun. Marcus smiled, nodded, said all the right things, then continued exactly as before, because in his mind results proved him right. His ironwork was exceptional. His business thrived. His reputation grew. Clearly the spiritual warnings were just superstition maintained by elders afraid of change. Other young smiths noticed Marcus's success. Noticed that he spent less time on ritual and more time on production. Noticed that dismissing the spiritual didn't seem to harm his work. They began to follow his example, treating the forge as merely technical rather than sacred, viewing iron as just metal rather than divine gift. The shift was gradual. Not dramatic rebellion but slow erosion. The rituals became rushed. The offerings became smaller. The prayers became rote. The sacred days were still observed but grudgingly, seen as lost productivity rather than necessary rest. The older smiths protested, insisted on maintaining tradition, but they were dismissed as old-fashioned, as clinging to outdated beliefs in an age of progress and prosperity. Marcus became the voice of this new approach, the example others followed, the proof that skill mattered more than spirituality. He was 30 years old when he committed the violation that changed everything, the act that brought down the curse, the moment when accumulated disrespect finally crossed the line into active transgression. It happened during festival season, a sacred day when all forges should have been cold, when smiths should have been honoring Ogun through rest and ceremony rather than labor. But Marcus had received a commission. A wealthy patron wanted elaborate ironwork for a new palace. The payment was substantial. The deadline was tight. Marcus calculated that working through the sacred day would allow him to meet the deadline and claim the payment. The elders heard about his plan, came to stop him. You cannot work on this day, they insisted. It violates the first law. The forge must rest when Ogun rests. Marcus looked at them with barely concealed contempt. Ogun isn't real. He's a story we tell, a tradition we maintain. But iron is just metal. The forge is just fire. There's no spiritual dimension, just chemistry and technique. The elders were shocked, horrified. This wasn't just disrespect. This was outright denial, rejection of everything the craft was built on. You don't believe that, one elder said. You can't believe that. I do. And I'll prove it. I'm working today. And nothing will happen. Because there's nothing to happen. No spirits. No divine law. No curse. Just superstition. Please, another elder begged. For your own sake. For the sake of all who follow this craft. Don't do this. But Marcus had already made his decision. He lit his forge on the sacred day. Deliberately. Defiantly. Challenging Ogun to respond. Proving through his planned success that the spiritual was irrelevant. The elders left. Unable to stop him. Unable to do anything but pray that somehow the violation would be overlooked. That mercy would prevail over justice. Marcus worked through the sacred day. Created beautiful ironwork. Perfectly crafted. Technically flawless. He finished as the sun set. Stood back and admired his work. See, he said to his apprentices who had reluctantly assisted. Nothing happened. No curse. No divine anger. Just excellent work completed efficiently. He cleaned his tools. Banked his forge. Went home satisfied. Convinced he had proven his point. That he had freed his craft from the weight of superstition. He was wrong. The curse didn't arrive immediately. Didn't strike him down in dramatic fashion. The Orishas rarely work that way. Their justice is thorough, complete, designed to teach rather than simply punish. The curse began the next morning. When Marcus returned to his forge to continue work on the commission, he lit the fire as always, let it heat as always, took his first piece of iron to shape. The moment his hammer struck the heated metal, pain shot through his hands. Not from the work, from something else. Something that felt like the iron itself had become hostile. Marcus dropped the hammer, examined his hands. No visible injury, no burn, no cut, just pain. It, persistent, radiating from bones. He tried again. Same result. The moment metal touched metal, agony. He thought perhaps he'd injured himself without realizing. Rested his hands. Tried the next day. Same pain. Worse if anything. Within a week, Marcus couldn't work at all. His hands, the hands that had created the finest ironwork in the region, were useless for the craft. Not damaged, just unable to touch iron without excruciating pain. He went to healers. They found nothing wrong. No physical cause for the pain. No treatment that helped. He went to the elders. They looked at him with sadness. You violated sacred law, they said. On the most sacred day. In full knowledge and deliberate defiance. Did you think there would be no consequence? Fix it, Marcus demanded. Undo this. We can't. The elders shook their heads. The curse came from Ogun himself. Only Ogun can lift it. And he has no reason to show you mercy. Then I'll make offerings. Apologize. Do whatever is required. You can try. But understand, curses from the Orishas aren't punishments to be negotiated away. They're consequences. Natural results of broken relationships. You didn't just break a rule. You broke the sacred contract between iron and blessing. Marcus tried anyway. Made elaborate offerings. Performed extensive rituals. Begged for forgiveness. Nothing changed. His hands remained cursed. Unable to work iron. Unable to practice the craft that had defined his entire life. But the curse didn't stop with Marcus. That would have been mercy. This was justice. Every smith who had followed Marcus's example felt it too. Every forge that had worked on sacred days. Every craftsman who had dismissed the spiritual dimension. All of them found their hands cursed. Unable to work iron without pain. The blacksmiths who had maintained the old ways remained unaffected. Their hands worked as always. Their forges blessed as always. But they were few. The majority had followed Marcus into apostasy. Into the belief that skill replaced spirituality. Now the majority suffered. Worse still, the curse passed to their children. And their children's children. Any descendant of a cursed smith inherited the affliction. Could learn the technical skills perfectly. But could never work iron without the pain that marked them as coming from cursed lineage. Within a generation, the Yoruba blacksmith craft was crippled. Most of those who had the skill couldn't practice it. Those who could practice it were too few to meet the society's needs. Iron tools became scarce. Expensive. Yoruba's technological advantage evaporated. Other peoples who had once sought Yoruba iron began producing their own. The prosperity that iron had brought began to crumble. All because one man had believed skill could replace reverence. Because pride had convinced him that human ability was enough. Because he had treated sacred gift as mere resource. The curse became known as the iron sickness. Spoken of in whispers. Feared by anyone whose lineage traced to blacksmiths. A mark of ancestral sin that couldn't be washed away. Couldn't be negotiated with. Couldn't be escaped. Marcus lived to see all of this. Lived to watch his pride destroy not just his own life but countless others. Lived to understand too late that the elders had been right. That the spiritual dimension was real. That Ogun's laws existed for profound reasons. He died broken. Spiritually and physically. His hands still cursed. his reputation destroyed, his name spoken as warning rather than praise. But his death didn't end the story, because curses don't die with the cursed. They continue, generation after generation, teaching, transforming, demanding that descendants learn what ancestors refused to understand. 3 generations after Marcus's death, the curse had reshaped Yoruba society completely. What had been a people known for exceptional ironwork became a people who had to import basic tools. What had been pride became shame. What had been blessing became burden. The uncursed smiths, those few whose ancestors had maintained the sacred laws, tried to fill the gap. But they were too few. And they were aging. Their children could be taught the craft, but teaching took time. Years. Decades. A generation of knowledge couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Meanwhile, the cursed families suffered in different ways. Some tried to hide their lineage, claimed descent from farmers or traders rather than smiths, hoped that denial might somehow break the inheritance. It never worked. The curse knew bloodlines better than any human record. Children would grow up believing themselves free of the taint, only to feel the iron pain the first time they tried to work metal. The curse announcing itself, claiming another generation. Other families embraced the curse as penance, accepted it as deserved punishment for ancestral sin. They became priests instead of smiths, dedicated themselves to serving Ogun in other ways, maintaining his shrines, teaching his laws, ensuring that future generations understood what their ancestors had learned too late. But some families refused both denial and acceptance. They searched for a way to break the curse, to earn back what had been lost, to restore the sacred relationship between their lineage and iron. In the 4th generation after Marcus, there lived a young woman named Grace. She came from one of the most cursed bloodlines. Her great-great-grandfather had been Marcus's most devoted follower, had worked on sacred days, had dismissed the spiritual even more completely than Marcus had. The curse in Grace's family was particularly severe. Not just pain when touching iron but actual burning. Blisters that appeared instantly. Scars that never healed properly. The iron rejected them more violently than it rejected others. Grace grew up watching her father suffer. He had been trained as a smith before the curse manifested, had learned every technical skill perfectly. But the moment he tried to practice his craft, his hands erupted in agony. Blisters covering his palms. Scars layering over scars. He tried for years, convinced he could push through. Convinced determination could overcome curse. Each attempt left him more damaged, more scarred, more broken. By the time Grace was 15, her father's hands were useless. Gnarled masses of scar tissue that couldn't grip properly, couldn't feel properly, couldn't do anything that required fine motor control. He died when Grace was 17. Died bitter. Convinced that Ogun was cruel. That divine justice was excessive. That his suffering had been undeserved since he hadn't personally violated any law, just inherited the consequences of someone else's violation. Grace disagreed. She looked at her father's suffering and saw not cruelty but consequence. Saw not excessive punishment but natural result. She understood something her father never had, that the curse wasn't punishment, it was teaching. She began to study. Not smithing, she knew she'd inherited the curse same as her father. But the spiritual dimensions of iron, the nature of Ogun, the reasons behind the 7 laws, the relationship between material and sacred. She spoke with the old priests, the ones who maintained Ogun's shrines despite not being able to work iron themselves. They taught her what they knew. About Ogun's nature. About why iron was sacred. About what the laws actually protected. Grace learned that iron wasn't just useful metal. It was transformative material. Or from the earth became tools that transformed human capability. This physical transformation mirrored spiritual transformation. The same fire that changed her into iron was meant to change craftsmen into something more conscious, more aware, more connected to divine forces. The laws existed to maintain this dual transformation, to ensure that working with iron remained sacred act rather than merely technical process, to prevent the spiritual dimension from being lost in the pursuit of material benefit. When smiths treated iron as merely material, they broke the transformative circuit, cut themselves off from the sacred flow. The curse was simply that disconnection made manifest. The pain was spiritual reality translated into physical sensation. Understanding this changed everything for Grace. She realized that breaking the curse wasn't about appeasing an angry God. It was about restoring a broken relationship, reconnecting with the sacred dimension that her ancestors had severed. She brought her insights to the Council of Elders, to the priests who served Ogun, to the uncursed smiths who still maintain the old ways. "I want to try something," she told them. "I want to attempt the forge again. Not to prove I can overcome the curse through determination, but to humble myself before Ogun, to acknowledge what was broken, to ask, not demand, for restoration." The elders were skeptical. "Many have tried this approach. All have failed. The curse is too deep, too complete." "Maybe they tried with the wrong understanding," Grace replied. "Maybe they approached Ogun as supplicants seeking favor. I want to approach as someone accepting responsibility, as someone willing to serve even without being able to practice the craft, as someone choosing relationship over result." The priests considered this. It was different from previous attempts. Most people came to Ogun asking for the curse to be lifted so they could work iron. Grace was offering to serve Ogun whether the curse was lifted or not. "We'll support this," the head priest finally said. "But understand, you may suffer like your father. May damage your hands permanently. May learn nothing except that some curses cannot be broken. I understand. But I have to try. Not for myself. For all who carry this burden. Someone has to model a different approach." Grace prepared for a full year. Not by practicing smithing techniques, but by studying Ogun's nature, by learning the prayers, by understanding the spiritual landscape she was about to enter, by becoming as close to Ogun as possible without actually working iron. She fasted regularly, purified herself according to ancient protocols, made offerings not because she expected immediate return but because offering itself was the relationship. She wasn't negotiating. She was loving. The uncursed smiths watched this with interest, some with hope, others with sadness, believing she was setting herself up for devastating disappointment. But one old smith, a man who had learned directly from Joseph's last living student, saw something different in Grace's preparation. "You understand something most don't," he told her. "That the curse isn't locked to be picked. It's relationship to be restored. You can't trick your way out of it. Can't negotiate it away. Can only grow back into right relationship. And even then, restoration may not look like what you expect." "What do you mean?" The old smith smiled. "Maybe restoration doesn't mean you get to work iron. Maybe it means you find peace with not working iron. Maybe it means the curse stops hurting because you stop fighting it. There are many kinds of healing." Grace absorbed this, understood that she was seeking restoration of relationship, not necessarily restoration of ability. The distinction mattered. After a year of preparation, Grace went to the oldest forge still in operation, the one maintained by the last lineage of uncursed smiths. She asked permission to attempt working iron there. The master smith agreed. But on conditions. You work alone. No assistance. No intervention if the curse manifests. You face this yourself. Face Ogun yourself. We'll pray for you. But we won't protect you from the consequences of your attempt. Grace accepted these terms. At dawn on a sacred day, not a forbidden day but one dedicated to honoring Ogun, Grace approached the forge. She didn't light it immediately. First she prayed. Not prayers asking for success. Prayers acknowledging Ogun's sovereignty. Prayers accepting whatever came. Prayers offering herself in service regardless of outcome. Then she lit the fire. Used the traditional method. Honored each step of the process. Made the ritual offering before beginning work. The uncursed smith had left a piece of iron or prepared. Grace placed it in the forge. Let it heat. Watched the metal begin to glow. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. From awareness of the sacred. From understanding that this moment carried weight beyond her personal story. When the iron reached proper temperature, Grace removed it, placed it on the anvil, picked up the hammer. This was the moment her father had faced countless times, the moment that had destroyed his hands, the moment when the curse would manifest or wouldn't. Grace raised the hammer, brought it down on the glowing iron. Pain shot through her hands. Immediate, intense, exactly as her father had described, like the iron itself was attacking her, like her bones were shattering from inside. Grace cried out, dropped the hammer, staggered back from the forge. The pain was overwhelming, all-consuming. She looked at her hands expecting to see blisters forming, skin burning, the physical manifestation of spiritual rejection. But there was nothing. Her hands looked normal, undamaged. The pain was entirely internal, entirely spiritual. The iron not physically harming her but spiritually rejecting her. Grace could have stopped there. Should have stopped there. The curse had manifested. The experiment had failed. Continuing would only increase the suffering. But something in her refused to quit. Not determination to overcome, but willingness to endure, to stay present with the pain, to not run from what she was experiencing. She picked up the hammer again, struck the iron again. The pain intensified, worse than before, so severe that Grace's vision blurred. Her legs weakened. Everything in her screamed to stop, to flee, to never touch iron again. But she stayed, struck again, and again, and again, not trying to work the iron properly, not trying to shape it, just striking, enduring, staying present with the pain rather than fleeing from it. She struck for perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps an hour. Time became meaningless. There was only the pain, the iron, the choice to continue. Then something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed quality, became less like attack and more like communication. Like the iron was speaking. Like Ogun himself was present in the suffering. Grace heard no words, but understanding flowed into her anyway. Wordless. Truth that bypassed language entirely. The curse had never been about punishment. It had been about protection. About preventing cursed lineages from spreading spiritual corruption through their work. About containing the damage of broken relationship. Iron worked without proper spiritual foundation carried that brokenness into the world. Tools made by cursed hands wouldn't just be technically inferior. They'd carry spiritual contamination. They'd spread the disconnection from sacred into everything they touched. The curse was mercy, preventing this spreading, protecting the world from corrupted iron, protecting the cursed themselves from compounding their ancestors' errors. Grace understood, accepted. The pain was real, but it wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. It was the sacred protecting itself. With this understanding, Grace set down the hammer, not in defeat, in acceptance. She spoke aloud, to Ogun, to the iron, to the sacred forces present in the forge. I understand now. The curse protects what needs protecting. I don't ask you to lift it. I ask only to serve you in whatever way you'll accept. If I can't work iron, teach me how else to honor you. How else to maintain what my ancestors broke. The pain in her hands began to fade. Not dramatically, gradually, like water receding after flood. Grace left the forge, her hands still aching but not burning, changed but not damaged. She had struck iron and survived, not because she'd overcome the curse, but because she'd accepted it, had stopped fighting what needed to be accepted. The old smith who had watched from a distance approached her. What did you learn? Her hands trembled, not from fear, from awareness of the sacred, from understanding that this moment carried weight beyond her personal story. When the iron reached proper temperature, Grace removed it, placed it on the anvil, picked up the hammer. This was the moment. The moment her father had faced countless times. The moment that had destroyed his hands. The moment when the curse would manifest or wouldn't. Grace raised the hammer, brought it down on the glowing iron. Pain shot through her hands. Immediate, intense, exactly as her father had described. Like the iron itself was attacking her. Like her bones were shattering from inside. Grace cried out, dropped the hammer, staggered back from the forge. The pain was overwhelming, all-consuming. She looked at her hands expecting to see blisters forming, skin burning, the physical manifestation of spiritual rejection. But there was nothing. Her hands looked normal, undamaged. The pain was entirely internal, entirely spiritual. The iron not physically harming her but spiritually rejecting her. Grace could have stopped there. Should have stopped there. The curse had manifested. The experiment had failed. Continuing would only increase the suffering. But something in her refused to quit. Not determination to overcome, but willingness to endure. To stay present with the pain. To not run from what she was experiencing. She picked up the hammer again. Struck the iron again. The pain intensified. Worse than before. So severe that Grace's vision blurred. Her legs weakened. Everything in her screamed to stop. To flee. To never touch iron again. But she stayed. Struck again. And again. And again. Not trying to work the iron properly. Not trying to shape it. Just striking. Enduring. Staying present with the pain rather than fleeing from it. She struck for perhaps 10 minutes. Perhaps an hour. Time became meaningless. There was only the pain. The iron. The choice to continue. Then something shifted. The pain didn't disappear. But it changed quality. Became less like attack and more like communication. Like the iron was speaking. Like Ogun himself was present in the suffering. Grace heard no words. But understanding flowed into her anyway. Wordless. Truth that bypassed language entirely. The curse had never been about punishment. It had been about protection. About preventing cursed lineages from spreading spiritual corruption through their work. About containing the damage of broken relationship. Iron worked without proper spiritual foundation carried that brokenness into the world. Tools made by cursed hands wouldn't just be technically inferior. They'd carry spiritual contamination. They'd spread the disconnection from sacred into everything they touched. The curse was mercy, preventing this spreading. Protecting the world from corrupted iron. Protecting the cursed themselves from compounding their ancestors' errors. Grace understood, accepted. The pain was real. But it wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. It was the sacred protecting itself. With this understanding, Grace set down the hammer. Not in defeat. In acceptance. She spoke aloud. To Ogun. To the iron. To the sacred forces present in the forge. I understand now. The curse protects what needs protecting. I don't ask you to lift it. I ask only to serve you in whatever way you'll accept. If I can't work iron, teach me how else to honor you. How else to maintain what my ancestors broke. The pain in her hands began to fade. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like water receding after flood. Grace left the forge. Her hands still aching but not burning. Changed but not damaged. She had struck iron and survived. Not because she'd overcome the curse. But because she'd accepted it. Had stopped fighting what needed to be accepted. The old smith who had watched from a distance approached her. What did you learn? That some curses aren't meant to be broken. Just understood. Just accepted. Just transformed from burden into teacher. He nodded. Satisfied. You've learned in one morning what most never learn in a lifetime. Grace returned to her community. She didn't claim to have broken the curse. didn't claim any victory, just shared what she'd learned. Some descendants of cursed smiths heard her and found peace, stopped fighting their limitation, started seeking other ways to serve Ogun, other ways to honor iron without working it directly. Others rejected her message, insisted that acceptance was giving up, that they shouldn't have to carry consequences for someone else's sin. But grace had planted something, a different way of understanding the curse. Not as injustice to be overcome but as boundary to be respected, as teacher rather than enemy. Grace's acceptance of the curse didn't break it, but it did something else, something perhaps more important. It shifted how cursed families understood their place in the sacred order. For generations, cursed lineages had lived with shame, had hidden their ancestry, had viewed themselves as spiritually damaged, as lesser, as marked by ancestral sin in ways that could never be redeemed. Grace offered a different narrative. Not that they were damaged but that they carried a specific role. Not that they were cursed in the sense of being condemned but that they bore witness to what happens when sacred boundaries are crossed. She began teaching this openly. Not as a priest, she had no formal religious authority, but as someone who had experienced the curse directly and found meaning within it. The cursed cannot work iron, she would say. True. But we can teach why iron must be worked with reverence. We can maintain Ogun's shrines. We can ensure the 7 laws are never forgotten. We can be living reminders of what our ancestors learned through terrible cost. This reframing attracted attention. Some cursed families began to gather around grace, forming a community of understanding rather than shame, meeting regularly to discuss how to serve Ogun despite, or perhaps through, their limitation. They created new roles, new ways of participating in the sacred dimension of iron without actually working it. Some became record keepers, documenting the history of the curse, recording the names of all cursed lineages, tracking the genealogy so that no one could claim ignorance of their heritage, so that no cursed descendant would attempt smithing and suffer unexpected pain. Knowledge is service. Others became teachers, not of smithing technique but of smithing spirituality. They taught the uncursed smiths about the 7 laws, about Ogun's nature, about why the spiritual dimension mattered. They ensured that technical skill was always paired with spiritual understanding, teaching as service. Still others became shrine maintainers. Ogun's temples needed constant care. Fires needed tending. Offerings needed preparation. Sacred spaces needed protection. The curse could do all of this, could serve Ogun intimately despite being unable to work his metal. Maintenance as service. This reorganization took years. Not all cursed families accepted it. Many remained bitter, remained convinced that acceptance was surrender, that they should keep fighting for restoration of what was lost. But enough families embraced the new understanding that a shift began. Cursed lineages stopped being seen purely as shameful, started being recognized as carriers of crucial knowledge, as preventers of future violation, as bridges between the material and spiritual dimensions of iron. The uncursed smiths noticed this shift. Some welcomed it, appreciated having dedicated teachers of the spiritual aspects, appreciated the cursed families taking ownership of sacred education rather than leaving it to aging priests who would eventually die without replacement. Others resented it, viewed the cursed families as trying to claim importance they hadn't earned, as dressing up their limitation in spiritual language to make themselves feel better. A particular tension developed between Michael, the most skilled uncursed smith of his generation, and Grace's growing community of curse-bearers. Michael was technically brilliant, could create ironwork of stunning complexity and beauty, but he was impatient with spiritual teaching, viewed it as distraction from the real work, maintained the 7 laws because tradition demanded it, not because he believed they mattered spiritually. He sounds like Marcus, some elders noted with concern. He's nothing like Marcus, Michael's supporters insisted. He keeps the laws, never works on sacred days, makes proper offerings. He just doesn't waste time on excessive spirituality. But Grace saw the similarity, saw the same attitude that had led to the original curse. The belief that technique was what mattered, that spirituality was decoration, that keeping laws mechanically was sufficient even without understanding their purpose. She tried to speak with Michael, to share what she'd learned, to warn him that his approach, while technically compliant, missed something essential. Michael dismissed her, politely but completely. "You can't work iron," he said. "You've never felt what it's like to shape metal properly, to create something beautiful from raw ore. What could you possibly teach me about my craft? I can teach you why your craft is sacred, why the laws exist, why Ogun demands more than mechanical compliance. I know why. To maintain tradition, to honor our ancestors, to keep the social order. I do all of that. My work speaks for itself. Does it?" Grace looked at the elaborate ironwork Michael had created. Technically perfect, aesthetically beautiful. "But when I look at your work, I see skill. I don't see the sacred. I see human achievement, not divine partnership." Michael's face hardened. "That's because you're jealous. You can't create, so you criticize those who can. You dress up your limitation as spiritual wisdom to make yourself feel important." The conversation ended badly. The divide between Michael's faction and Grace's community deepened. For several years, an uneasy peace held. The uncursed Smiths continued their work. The cursed families continued their teaching and service. The two groups coexisted but didn't truly cooperate. Then a crisis arrived that forced everyone to confront what they'd been avoiding. A terrible drought struck the Yoruba kingdoms. Not ordinary dry season but years-long absence of rain. Crops failed. Rivers shrank. Wells ran dry. People began to starve. The priests consulted with Ogun, with other Orishas, seeking understanding of why this calamity had come, seeking intervention, seeking any path back to prosperity. The answer that came back was disturbing. The drought wasn't random. It was consequence. The Orishas were displeased with how their gifts were being honored. Specifically, Ogun was displeased with how iron was being treated. The people were confused. The laws were being kept. The forges rested on sacred days. Offerings were made. What more did Ogun want? The head priest consulted with the oldest spiritual authorities, with those few elders who still remembered what the relationship with Ogun had been like before the curse, before the split between cursed and uncursed, before the division. They delivered difficult news. Ogun is not satisfied with mechanical compliance. He demands genuine relationship, demands that iron workers understand what they're doing spiritually, not just technically. The current generation of smiths keep laws without understanding them. They work with skill but without reverence. This is not enough. But we have teachers, the people protested. The cursed families teach about the spiritual dimension. They maintain the shrines. They keep the knowledge. And the uncursed smiths ignore them, the priest replied. Dismiss them. View them as inferior. The knowledge exists but it doesn't flow. The sacred dimension is taught but not learned. This satisfies neither Ogun nor the other Orishas. You have created a society where the spiritual and material are separated rather than unified, where some know the spirit without the skill and others have the skill without the spirit. This division is the problem. The people grasped the issue, but solutions were less obvious. How do you force proud, skilled craftsmen to learn from those they view as cursed? How do you bridge a divide built on generations of resentment and shame? The Council of Elders debated for weeks. Finally, they made a controversial decision. They decreed that no smith could continue practicing their craft unless they could demonstrate spiritual understanding equal to their technical skill. That all uncursed smiths must study with the cursed families, must learn the deeper dimensions of their work, must prove they understood why the laws existed, not just how to follow them. The uncursed smiths rebelled. This is absurd. We're being forced to learn from those who can't even practice the craft. From failures. From the cursed. You're being asked to learn from those who understand what you've forgotten, the head elder replied. That the curse exists not as punishment but as teaching. That it protects the sacred. That your technical skill means nothing without spiritual depth. Michael led the opposition. He gathered the most skilled uncursed smiths, argued that this decree was unnecessary, that their work proved their worthiness, that forcing them to study with the cursed was humiliation without purpose. The drought will continue until Ogun is satisfied, the priest said simply. You can refuse to learn, but the land will pay the price of your pride. This created a terrible dilemma. Continue refusing and watch people starve. Submit to what felt like humiliation. Choose between pride and community survival. Most smiths reluctantly chose community, began attending the teachings offered by Grace and others in the cursed community, came with resentment, with resistance, but came. Michael held out longest, insisted he didn't need teaching from those who couldn't work iron. His skill was sufficient proof of his understanding. But as the drought continued, as people continued to suffer, as pressure mounted, even Michael finally, grudgingly, agreed to attend. Grace taught him personally, not to humiliate, but because he was the most resistant, the most convinced of his own sufficiency, the most like Marcus. Their sessions were tense. Michael questioned everything, challenged every teaching, insisted that Grace was making spirituality unnecessarily complicated, that the laws were simple. Follow them. That was enough. Grace was patient. She didn't argue, just taught, explaining why each law existed, what each protected, how the spiritual and material were meant to work together rather than separately. She taught Michael about the nature of transformation, how iron ore wasn't just heated but transformed, how that physical transformation was meant to mirror the spiritual transformation of the smith, how working iron was meant to be practice and conscious participation with divine forces. She taught him about pride, how believing skill came from himself alone rather than from partnership with Ogun was the original error, the error that led to the curse, the error he was repeating. She taught him about the cursed families, how they bore witness, how their pain served a purpose, how their inability to work iron protected both them and the world from spiritually contaminated metalwork. Michael listened, grudgingly at first, then with growing understanding, then with something like horror as he realized how much he'd been missing, how similar his attitude was to Marcus's, how close he'd come to repeating the original violation. After 3 months of intensive study, Michael stood before the Council of Elders, demonstrated not just his technical knowledge, which had never been in question, but his spiritual understanding, his grasp of why the laws existed, his appreciation for the sacred dimension of his work. The elders tested him thoroughly, asked difficult questions, probed his understanding. Finally, satisfied, they approved his return to the forge. But Michael didn't return immediately. He asked Grace if he could assist with shrine maintenance for a season. Wanted to serve Ogun in ways that didn't involve creating. Wanted to practice humility. Wanted to internalize what he'd learned before applying it to his craft. Grace agreed. Michael spent 6 months tending Ogun's shrine alongside the cursed families, learning to honor the god not through skill but through simple service, learning that worthiness didn't come from ability but from relationship, When he finally returned to his forge, his work changed. Not technically, he'd always been skilled, but spiritually, the iron he shaped now carried something more. Something that those sensitive to such things could feel. Blessing rather than just craft. Partnership rather than just technique. Other smiths noticed, came to understand what Grace and the Cursed families had been teaching. That the spiritual dimension wasn't decoration, wasn't optional, was the foundation everything else was built on. The drought began to ease. Not dramatically, gradually, as more smiths learned. As the division between spiritual and material began to heal. As the community moved toward the integration Ogun had always demanded. Grace watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. The curse on her hands remained. She still couldn't work iron without pain. But she'd found her purpose, her role, her way of serving. Not all cursed families accepted this path. Some remained bitter. Some still sought ways to break the curse rather than understand it. But enough embraced the new paradigm that it became sustainable. That it created a lasting change in how Yoruba society approached iron and the sacred. The relationship between cursed and uncursed transformed. No longer shame and superiority, but different roles in the same sacred work. The uncursed provided the technical skill. The cursed provided the spiritual teaching. Together they maintained the balance Ogun required. It wasn't perfect. Tensions remained. Individual pride still caused problems. But the framework existed now. The understanding that both skill and spirit were necessary. That both cursed and uncursed had crucial roles. That division served no one while integration served everyone. Grace lived to see this transformation take root. Lived to see cursed families stop hiding in shame. Lived to see uncursed smiths treating spiritual teaching with the same respect they gave technical training. Lived to see the drought end and prosperity return. She died at 60, still unable to work iron, still carrying the pain that came from touching the sacred metal. But she died understanding that her curse had been her calling. That what she couldn't do had revealed what she could do. That limitation had been doorway rather than prison. Her students, both cursed and uncursed, continued her work, ensuring that the spiritual dimension of iron was never again lost. That the lessons Marcus had learned too late were passed forward clearly. That the curse remained teaching rather than just tragedy. 200 years after Grace's death, the Yoruba kingdoms had fully integrated the lessons she taught. The curse remained. Cursed lineages still couldn't work iron without pain. But the meaning had transformed completely. Children born into cursed families no longer grew up with shame. They grew up understanding they carried a sacred responsibility. They were the keepers of spiritual knowledge, the teachers of reverence, the living reminders of why iron must never be treated as merely material. The education of a Yoruba blacksmith had become rigorous. Years of technical training paired with years of spiritual study. No one was allowed to practice the craft until they could demonstrate mastery of both dimensions. The system worked well. Yoruba iron regained its reputation for quality. Not just technical quality but something deeper. Spiritual quality that people could sense even if they couldn't name. Iron worked with proper reverence carried blessing into the world. Tools made by properly trained smiths lasted longer. Worked better. Felt better in the hand. But no system is perfect. And human nature being what it is, complacency eventually returned. Not the open rebellion of Marcus. Something subtler. More insidious. The problem began with success. Yoruba iron became so valued that demand exceeded supply. Other kingdoms, other peoples, offered enormous prices for Yoruba metalwork. Wealth flowed into the smith communities. Prosperity returned. With prosperity came pressure. Pressure to produce more. To work faster. To maximize output. The spiritual training, which took years, began to feel like obstacle rather than necessity. Some younger smiths began to question, why do we need years of spiritual study? Why can't we simply learn the laws and follow them mechanically? Why waste time on meditation and prayer and shrine service when we could be creating? When we could be producing? When we could be meeting demand? The cursed families, in their role as teachers, resisted this erosion, insisted that spiritual depth couldn't be rushed, that understanding took time to develop, that mechanical compliance without genuine relationship would eventually lead back to the same crisis that created the curse. But economic pressure is powerful. Families who lived well from smithing wanted their children to begin practicing sooner, to start earning sooner, to contribute to prosperity sooner. A compromise emerged. The spiritual training remained required, but it was shortened, condensed, made more efficient. What had taken 5 years was reduced to 2. What had been immersive was made more superficial. The cursed families protested. This isn't enough time. Understanding can't be rushed. You're recreating the conditions that led to the curse. But we're not abandoning the spiritual, the smiths argued. We're just being more efficient. We still teach the laws, still explain their importance. We're just not wasting time on excessive mysticism. The head priest at the time was a man named Thomas. He came from a cursed lineage, had spent his entire life in spiritual service. He understood what was happening, recognized the pattern. He called a gathering, brought together all the elders, all the cursed families, all the practicing smiths, all the apprentices, everyone involved in the iron trade. In front of this assembly, Thomas spoke. We are repeating our ancestors' mistakes. Not identically, more cleverly. We're not openly rejecting the spiritual. We're just marginalizing it, treating it as requirement to check off rather than foundation to build on. This is how erosion happens. Not through dramatic rebellion but through subtle compromise. Through efficiency that values production over transformation. Many smiths shifted uncomfortably, recognizing truth they'd been trying to avoid. Thomas continued. The curse wasn't random punishment. It was natural consequence of broken relationship. When we treat iron as merely material, when we view spiritual training as obstacle rather than necessity, we break that relationship again. Maybe not immediately, maybe not obviously, but break it nonetheless. What are you saying? One young smith asked. That we should go back to 5-year training? That's not economically sustainable. I'm saying that economic sustainability without spiritual sustainability is illusion. That prosperity built on eroded foundation will eventually collapse. That we have a choice to make now before crisis forces it on us. What choice? Between short-term gain and long-term wisdom. Between efficiency and depth. Between serving the market and serving Ogun. We can't do both perfectly. We must choose which takes priority. The debate that followed was intense. It divided the community along predictable lines. Older practitioners and cursed families arguing for maintaining rigorous spiritual training. Younger practitioners and merchants arguing for practical compromise. The argument continued for months. No consensus emerged. The community remained split. Then something happened that forced resolution. A young smith named Peter, trained under the shortened program, created a magnificent piece. An elaborate gate for a wealthy patron's palace. Technically flawless. Artistically stunning. The kind of work that should have brought honor to the entire craft. But something was wrong with it. The patron installed the gate as planned. Beautiful. Impressive. The envy of everyone who saw it. Then people started getting sick. Not everyone. Just those who passed through the gate regularly. The patron's family. His servants. Regular visitors. Strange sickness. No clear cause. No clear symptoms. Just gradual weakening. Drain of energy and vitality. Like something was slowly consuming them from inside. Healers were called. Found nothing medically wrong. The sickness persisted. Worsened. People who worked in the palace began leaving. Refusing to enter. Word spread that the place was cursed. The patron, desperate, called for spiritual authorities. Priests came, examined the palace, performed divination. The gate, they announced. Something is wrong with the gate. It carries contamination. Not physical, spiritual. It's draining those who pass through it. That's impossible, Peter protested. I followed all the laws, made the proper offerings, did everything correctly. Did you? Thomas examined the gate carefully, ran his hands over it without actually touching the iron. His cursed hands prevented that. But he could sense the spiritual dimension. Or rather, the absence of it. This iron carries no blessing, Thomas said. Technically perfect. Spiritually empty. Worse than empty. It's become conduit for something harmful. For the disconnection you worked with. For the absence of real relationship with Ogun. I don't understand. Thomas looked at Peter with sadness. You learned the rituals. You performed them mechanically. But you never developed actual relationship with the sacred. Never understood what you were doing beyond checking boxes. Your work reflects that emptiness. An empty space doesn't stay empty. It fills with whatever is nearby. In this case, with the spiritual equivalent of corruption. What do? The gate must be destroyed. Completely. The iron melted down and re-blessed. Only then can it be worked again. By someone who understands the sacred dimension. Not just intellectually. Experientially. Peter was devastated. His masterwork, the piece he'd spent months creating, condemned as spiritually toxic. His reputation destroyed. His confidence shattered. But more importantly, the community was shaken. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was concrete evidence that spiritual training mattered. That mechanical compliance wasn't enough. That the depth Grace had insisted on wasn't excessive mysticism but essential foundation. The debate ended. Not through argument but through demonstration. The community chose depth over efficiency. Chose relationship over production. Chose to restore the rigorous spiritual training even if it meant producing less iron. The economic consequences were real. Yoruba production decreased. Other regions who had been importing Yoruba iron began developing their own smithing traditions. The wealth that had been flowing into Yoruba kingdoms slowed. But something else happened. The iron that was produced carried undeniable quality. Spiritual quality that couldn't be faked or rushed. Tools that lasted generations. Weapons that carried blessing rather than just sharp edges. Metalwork that people treasured not just for beauty but for how it felt to own and use. Yoruba iron became rare but precious. A single piece worth more than dozens from other sources. Not because of artificial scarcity but because of genuine quality. Quality that came from proper relationship between craftsman and sacred. Peter, humbled by his failure, became one of the most dedicated students of spiritual training. He started over completely. Spent 5 years learning not just the rituals but their meaning. Not just the laws but their purpose. Not just the techniques but their spiritual foundation. When he finally returned to the forge, his work transformed. The same technical skill he'd always had. But now infused with something more. He created pieces that people reported felt alive. That carried presence. That seemed to hum with quiet blessing. He became teacher himself eventually. Specializing in showing young smiths why the spiritual dimension mattered. Using his own failure as cautionary tale. Using his transformation as proof that real learning was possible even after devastating error. But the most important development came from the cursed families themselves. They realized that their role needed to evolve. That teaching alone wasn't enough. They needed to embody what they taught more visibly. More powerfully. A woman named Ruth, descended from Grace's lineage, proposed something radical. She suggested that cursed families should attempt the forge regularly. Not to break the curse. Not even to create anything. But to witness. To remember. To maintain visceral connection to what they taught about. Most cursed families were horrified. Why deliberately inflict pain on ourselves? Why touch iron knowing it will hurt? What purpose does that serve? Ruth explained. We teach about the sacred dimension. About Ogun's reality. About the consequences of broken relationship. But our teaching becomes abstract without practice. If we regularly face the curse directly, we stay grounded in its reality. We don't just teach about pain, we carry it. We don't just speak about consequence, we embody it. This is asking us to suffer for no productive reason. Not for production. Ruth's voice was firm. For witness. For teaching that comes not from books or tradition but from lived experience. When I tell young Smiths that Ogun is real, that the spiritual dimension matters, they need to see that I've paid the cost of knowing this. That my knowledge isn't theoretical. Some cursed families embraced this practice. Once a month they would go to the forge, would attempt to work iron knowing it would cause pain, would endure briefly, then step back, not trying to overcome, just remembering, witnessing, maintaining direct connection to the reality they taught about. It was difficult, painful. Some cursed individuals couldn't sustain it. The pain was too intense, the practice too demanding. But those who did sustain it found something unexpected. The pain, when accepted rather than fought, became teacher. Each month at the forge deepened their understanding. Not of technique, they still couldn't actually work iron, but of relationship, of the sacred, of what it meant to encounter divine boundary directly. Their teaching changed, became more powerful, more grounded. Young Smiths who studied with these witness bearers reported that the lessons landed differently, carried more weight, felt more true, because they weren't just being taught about respect for sacred. They were learning from people who demonstrated that respect through willingness to suffer, who chose to encounter pain monthly rather than let their understanding become abstract, who embodied their teaching in ways that couldn't be faked. This practice spread slowly through cursed communities. Not all adopted it, but enough did that it became recognized tradition. The monthly witness at the forge. The deliberate encounter with curse as spiritual practice. The transformation of limitation into teaching method. The uncursed Smiths watching this were profoundly affected. These people could avoid all pain simply by staying away from iron. But they chose to face it regularly. For the sake of teaching. For the sake of maintaining real understanding. For the sake of witnessing to the sacred. If they make that choice, one young Smith said, "How can I complain about 5 years of spiritual training? My discomfort is nothing compared to their deliberate suffering." The practice of witness bearing did something else. It healed old divisions. Cursed and uncursed had coexisted for centuries. But distance remained. Resentment. Hierarchy. Watching cursed families deliberately embrace pain for the sake of teaching created respect. Not pity. Respect. Recognition that they were choosing to serve in ways that demanded more courage than working iron ever would. The two communities drew closer. Uncursed Smiths began to truly honor cursed teachers rather than just tolerating them. Cursed families felt their role validated. Not as failed Smiths but as essential witnesses. As carriers of knowledge that could only be maintained through willingness to suffer. Thomas, as head priest, watched this evolution with deep satisfaction. In his final years he gathered both communities together one last time. When the curse first fell he said, "We saw it as tragedy. As punishment we didn't deserve for sins we didn't commit. And it was tragedy. Many suffered. Many still suffer. But look at what it created. Look at what we've become because of it. We are a people who understand that the material and spiritual cannot be separated. That skill without reverence is dangerous. That some knowledge can only be maintained through those willing to bear witness even when witness hurts. The curse hasn't broken. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps it's permanent teaching rather than temporary punishment. Perhaps Ogun designed it to last forever because we need forever to fully learn what it teaches. Are we cursed? Yes. But we are also blessed. Blessed with knowledge others lack. Blessed with teachers who embody what they teach. Blessed with division that became integration. Blessed with tragedy that became purpose. Thomas died shortly after this speech. But his words became cornerstone of how Yoruba understood the curse going forward. Not as affliction to escape but as calling to fulfill. Not as wound to heal but as wisdom to embody. The system stabilized. Cursed families maintained spiritual teaching and monthly witness. Uncursed smiths underwent rigorous training in both technique and spirit. Together they produced iron that carried blessing, that served the world properly, that maintained relationship with Ogun. Centuries passed. The modern world arrived. Industrialization, mass production, new technologies, new challenges. Other peoples developed iron industries that produced vastly more than traditional Yoruba methods ever could. Cheaper, faster, more efficient. The economic pressure to abandon the old ways became enormous. Some Yoruba smiths did abandon them, moved to cities, learned industrial techniques, produced iron without any spiritual dimension, just material, just product, just commodity. These smiths thrived economically, but something was missing from their work, something they couldn't name but could feel. Their iron worked, but it didn't carry anything extra, didn't last quite as long, didn't feel quite as good in use. Meanwhile, those who maintained traditional methods struggled economically, couldn't compete on price or volume, served only those who valued quality over quantity, who recognized that some things couldn't be mass-produced without losing what made them valuable. The cursed families faced their own challenges. In modern context, their role seemed less relevant. Fewer people worked iron traditionally. Fewer needed spiritual teaching. The monthly witness felt increasingly like maintaining tradition for tradition's sake. Some younger cursed family members left, pursued other careers, saw no future in bearing witness to something fewer people valued. But others doubled down, recognized that the teaching the curse carried was needed more than ever in a world that treated everything as material, as commodity, as resource to exploit. They began translating the lessons into modern language, speaking not just about iron but about all work, all craft, all relationship with material world. Using the curse as example of what happens when we treat anything sacred as merely functional. In the present day, in a city in modern Nigeria, there lives a young woman named Rebecca. She is 24 years old, works as an engineer, designs bridges and buildings using computer software, lives in a world of steel and concrete and aluminum. She is also descended from Marcus, from the man who brought the curse into existence, from the lineage that carries the most severe form of the iron sickness. Rebecca grew up knowing about the curse. Her grandmother told her the stories about Marcus's pride, about the violation of sacred law, about generations who paid for one man's arrogance. But Rebecca, raised in modern context, viewed these stories as interesting cultural heritage, not as living reality, not as something that still mattered in a world of industrial production and computer-aided design. She studied engineering, excelled at mathematics and physics and material science, never touched traditional ironworking, never had reason to discover whether the curse still affected her, until a project came across her desk that changed everything. A wealthy client wanted to build a museum dedicated to traditional Yoruba crafts, including extensive displays about historical blacksmithing. The client specifically wanted authentic reproductions, wanted modern smiths to recreate traditional tools using traditional methods. Rebecca was assigned to oversee the metalwork, to coordinate with the few remaining traditional smiths, to ensure the reproductions were both historically accurate and structurally sound. She approached the project academically, researched traditional techniques, studied historical examples, arranged meetings with elderly smiths who still practiced the old ways. One of these smiths was an old man named Samuel, uncursed lineage, had learned from teachers who had learned from Grace's direct students. He maintained not just the technical tradition but the spiritual one. Samuel looked at Rebecca when they first met, really looked, past her modern clothes and professional demeanor, seeing something deeper. "You're descended from the cursed lines," he said. Not a question. Rebecca was startled. "How did you know?" "I can sense it. You carry the mark. Not visibly. Spiritually. You're one of Marcus's descendants. That's just family history." Rebecca dismissed this. "It doesn't affect me. I don't work with iron traditionally. I'm an engineer, not a blacksmith." Samuel smiled. Sadly. "The curse doesn't care about modern distinctions. Iron is iron. The sacred relationship exists regardless of whether we acknowledge it. I don't believe in sacred relationships with metal." Rebecca was polite but firm. "I believe in material properties, in stress calculations, in engineering principles." "Then you'll learn what your ancestor learned. That material reality and spiritual reality aren't separate. That treating them as separate creates problems your engineering can't solve." Rebecca thought Samuel was being superstitious, clinging to outdated beliefs. She continued with the project, coordinated with him professionally but dismissed his spiritual concerns as irrelevant. The museum project required her to visit traditional forges, to observe the process, to understand how things were made so she could ensure reproductions were authentic. She watched Samuel work, watched him prepare his forge, watched him make offerings before beginning, watched him pray over iron or before heating it. Interesting cultural practice, she noted in her documentation. Maintains historical authenticity. Samuel heard this, shook his head, but said nothing. She would learn or she wouldn't. Teaching couldn't be forced. Then came the day Rebecca needed to handle actual ironwork. The museum wanted a hands-on display, wanted visitors to be able to touch traditional tools, to feel their weight and balance. Rebecca was testing these pieces, examining them, holding them, checking that they met safety standards, that they wouldn't hurt visitors, that they were suitable for public handling. She picked up a traditionally forged blade. Beautiful piece. Samuel's work. She turned it over, examining the metal, the craftsmanship, the way it had been shaped. The moment her skin made full contact with the iron, pain shot through her hand. Immediate, intense, exactly as her ancestors had described. Like the metal itself was attacking her, like fire was radiating from bones. Rebecca dropped the blade, staggered back, looked at her hand expecting injury. Nothing visible. No burn, no cut, no physical damage. Just pain that radiated up her arm, pain that made her nauseous, pain that felt wrong in ways she couldn't name. Samuel had been watching, came over, not gloating, just sad. "Now you know," he said gently. "The curse is real, has always been real. Modern education doesn't erase it. Disbelief doesn't prevent it. It exists. You carry it. You always have." Rebecca wanted to argue, wanted to insist there must be a medical explanation. An allergy perhaps, a nerve condition, something rational. But she knew, deep down, this wasn't medical. This was exactly what the stories described. The curse manifesting, claiming her, announcing that she was bound to something her ancestors had broken. She left the forge, drove home in shock, her hands still aching, her worldview cracking. That night she called her grandmother, asked for the full story. Not the abbreviated version for children but the complete history. Everything about the curse, about what it meant, about how to live with it. Her grandmother, who had lived with the curse her entire life, who had never touched iron without pain, spoke for hours, explaining, teaching, sharing what generations had learned. "The curse isn't punishment," her grandmother said. "That's what young people always think. But it's not. It's protection. It prevents us from spreading spiritual contamination through work done without proper foundation. I don't understand spiritual contamination. Her grandmother sighed. I know you don't. Your education taught you that material is all that exists, that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. But that's incomplete truth. Material exists, but so does the sacred. And when you work with certain materials, iron especially, you're working in both dimensions whether you acknowledge it or not. That sounds like superstition. Does your hand still hurt? Rebecca looked at her palm. The pain had faded but hadn't disappeared completely. A dull ache remained. Reminder of contact with iron. Yes, that pain is real, physical, measurable. Your engineering can't explain it. Your medicine can't fix it. Your rationality can't dismiss it. So maybe your framework for understanding reality is incomplete. Rebecca had no response. Her grandmother was right. The pain was real, undeniable, unexplainable through her existing paradigm. What do I do? She finally asked. You have choices. Same choices all cursed descendants face. You can avoid iron completely. Stick to other materials, other engineering projects. Pretend the curse doesn't exist by simply not triggering it. Or you can learn what it teaches. You can study with the traditional teachers. Learn the spiritual dimension of material work. Understand what your ancestor violated and why it mattered. Transform your limitation into education. What does that accomplish? I still won't be able to work iron. No, but you'll understand why. And that understanding changes everything. Changes how you view all material, all work, all relationship with the physical world. Makes you better engineer even if you never touch iron again. Rebecca thought about this. About spending time learning what seemed like ancient superstition. About accepting that her modern education had missed something fundamental. But she also thought about the pain. About the undeniable reality of the curse. About the fact that dismissing it hadn't prevented it from affecting her. She made a decision. She would learn. Not because she believed, but because she needed to understand what was happening to her. She contacted Samuel. Asked if she could study with him. Not to become a smith, she knew that was impossible. But to learn the spiritual framework. The understanding that had been lost in her modern education. Samuel agreed. But set conditions. You'll attend the witness circle. You'll attempt the forge monthly like all learning curse do. You'll face the pain deliberately. Not to overcome it but to learn from it. Rebecca wanted to refuse. Wanted to say she'd learn intellectually without the suffering. But she remembered her grandmother's words about how understanding came through experience, not just theory. She agreed. The first witness circle was excruciating. Rebecca joined a group of cursed descendants. All ages. All backgrounds. All gathered at a traditional forge on the night of the new moon. One by one they approached the forge. Touched iron. Endured the pain that came. Not trying to work metal. Not trying to create. Just witnessing. Remembering. Maintaining connection to the reality they taught about. When Rebecca's turn came, she was terrified. Knowing the pain that awaited. Knowing it would be worse than the accidental contact in the museum. Knowing she was choosing to suffer. She picked up a simple iron bar. The pain exploded. Worse than before. More intense. More consuming. She held it for perhaps 10 seconds. Perhaps 5. Time became meaningless in the intensity. Then she set it down. Stepped back. Breathing hard. Tears streaming down her face. Samuel was there. Steady. Supporting but not rescuing. Now you know directly, he said. This is what your ancestor created. This is the reality of broken sacred relationship. Not theory. Experience. Rebecca wanted to hate it. Wanted to refuse to ever return. wanted to run back to her modern life and forget this existed. But something stopped her. In the midst of the pain, she'd felt something else. Something she couldn't name. Presence. Reality. The sense that she was encountering something genuinely sacred even through rejection. Even through boundary. Even through curse. She returned the next month. And the month after. Slowly building capacity not to endure more pain but to remain present with it. To not dissociate or flee mentally. To stay aware. To witness fully. The teachings Samuel offered began to make sense. Not intellectually, they'd always made intellectual sense. But experientially. Viscerally. In ways that transformed how she understood everything. She learned that iron wasn't just metal with certain physical properties. It was material that carried meaning. That connected to forces larger than chemistry. That demanded relationship, not just technical knowledge. She learned that the 7 laws weren't arbitrary rules. They were boundaries that maintained proper relationship. That protected both craftsmen and craft from corruption that came from treating sacred as merely functional. She learned that the curse wasn't punishment but consequence. Natural result of severed relationship. The pain she felt wasn't attack but rejection. The iron recognizing that she came from lineage that had broken trust. Maintaining boundary until trust was restored. But mostly she learned that modern education, for all its power, had created blind spots. Had taught her to see material reality while dismissing spiritual reality. Had given her tools to manipulate matter while ignoring that matter existed within sacred context. This learning transformed her engineering work. Not by making her religious. Not by making her reject modern methods. But by adding dimension her education had missed. She began to approach all materials with more reverence. Began to recognize that steel and concrete and aluminum all came from earth. All required transformation. All carried meaning beyond function. Her designs changed. Became more thoughtful. More aligned with natural forces rather than imposing on them. More beautiful not just aesthetically but spiritually. Buildings she designed felt different to people who used them. More harmonious. More alive somehow. Colleagues noticed. Asked what had changed in her approach. Rebecca struggled to explain. How do you tell modern engineers that you learned from a curse? That monthly pain taught you to see material differently? That spiritual dimension matters even in structural calculations? She spoke carefully. Talked about learning from traditional craftsmen. About understanding material history. About recognizing that buildings exist in cultural and spiritual context, not just physical. Some understood. Others dismissed her as having gone native. Clinging to outdated traditions. Rebecca didn't argue. Just continued her work. Let results speak. Buildings that felt right. Spaces that served humans not just functionally but holistically. The museum project completed. The displays opened. Rebecca had overseen metalwork that was both historically accurate and spiritually informed. Visitors reported that the traditional tools felt different from modern reproductions. Carried presence that couldn't be manufactured. On opening day, Samuel gave a speech. About the history of Yoruba ironworking. About the sacred dimension. About the curse and what it taught. He mentioned Rebecca. Mentioned that she came from cursed lineage. That she couldn't work iron but had learned from it anyway. That limitation had become doorway to deeper understanding. Rebecca stood there. Listening to her story told publicly. Feeling exposed. But also proud. She hadn't overcome the curse. Hadn't broken free of limitation. But she'd transformed relationship with it. Had learned what it taught. Had allowed it to make her better at her work even though she couldn't practice the traditional craft. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached her. Another cursed descendant. Older generation. had lived with the curse for 70 years. Thank you, the woman said, for showing young people that the curse has purpose, that it's not just tragedy, that accepting it doesn't mean giving up, that limitation can teach if we let it. Rebecca felt tears coming, understanding that her journey hadn't been just for herself, had been witnessing, teaching through example, showing others that the curse could be transformed. Years passed. Rebecca became known as an engineer who bridged traditional and modern, who understood both material science and material spirituality, who designed with technical precision and sacred awareness. She never worked iron. The curse never lifted. Monthly witness circles remained painful, but she'd found her role, her purpose, her way of serving. She began teaching, not engineering exactly, but integration. How to honor traditional wisdom while using modern tools. How to recognize sacred dimension in material work. How to build relationships with matter rather than just manipulating it. Her students came from cursed and uncursed lineages both. Some could work iron, others couldn't. But all learned that limitation wasn't failure, that boundary could be teacher, that curse carried wisdom. One day Rebecca returned to her grandmother, brought her to a building Rebecca had designed, a community center in a poor neighborhood. Beautiful, functional, but more than that, alive somehow, welcoming, sacred in ways that had nothing to do with religion. This is what the curse taught me, Rebecca said, that everything we create exists in both material and spiritual dimensions. That honoring both creates something that serves more completely. That limitation forced me to see what unlimited would have let me miss. Her grandmother, crying now, nodded. This is what Grace tried to teach. What generations of cursed families have witnessed. That the curse was never just punishment. It was invitation. To see more deeply. To work more consciously. To create more sacredly. Was it worth it? Rebecca asked. Generations of pain. Generations of limitation. Was the teaching worth the cost? Her grandmother thought for a long time. Then, I don't know if I can answer that. The pain is real. The limitation is real. The suffering of our ancestors was real. But look at what it created. Look at the wisdom it forced us to develop. Look at you. Look at this building. Look at the integration you've achieved. So yes, yes, and no, and yes. Her grandmother smiled. Some questions don't have simple answers. The curse is tragedy, and blessing, and teaching, all at once. We can hate it and honor it, suffer from it and grow through it, curse it and be grateful for it, all simultaneously. Rebecca understood. The curse would never be simple, would never be fully good or fully bad, would remain complex, difficult, demanding, teaching through pain, transforming through limitation, blessing through what looked like curse. She continued her work, continued monthly witness, continued teaching what the curse had taught her, continued building bridges, literal and metaphorical, between traditional and modern, between material and sacred, between what was lost and what was found. The iron sickness remains in Yoruba culture to this day. Cursed families still cannot work iron without pain. The curse has not lifted. Perhaps will never lift. Perhaps was never meant to. But its meaning has transformed completely. What began as consequence has become calling. What began as separation has become specialization. What began as loss has become gain of different kind. The cursed families are no longer shameful. They are honored, recognized as carriers of crucial wisdom, as teachers of dimension modern world desperately needs, as witnesses to sacred in age that treats everything as material. The traditional smiths who maintain the old ways are few, cannot compete economically with industrial production, serve small market of those who value quality over quantity. but their work carries something unmistakable. Blessing that comes from proper relationship. From honoring both technical and spiritual. From treating iron as sacred gift rather than mere resource. And between cursed teachers and uncursed craftsmen, the integration holds. The wisdom persists. The lesson continues. Generation after generation. Teaching what Marcus learned too late. What Grace learned through acceptance. What Rebecca learned through pain. That material and spiritual cannot be separated. That treating anything sacred as merely functional breaks relationship that must be maintained. That some things cannot be rushed or simplified or made efficient without losing what makes them valuable. That curse can become calling. That limitation can become doorway. That what looks like tragedy can, over generations, transform into wisdom. That Ogun's laws exist for reasons deeper than tradition. That iron demands relationship, not just technique. That some prices must be paid. Some boundaries must be honored. Some sacred connections must be maintained even when, especially when, doing so is difficult. This is the lesson the curse teaches. Still teaches. Will always teach. For as long as humans work with iron. For as long as we're tempted to treat sacred as merely material. For as long as we need reminders that the world holds more dimensions than our education acknowledges. The elders say, Iron kiasi ohun ti alufai ojunikinwa. Iron is not something that can be seen with eyes alone. It requires different seeing. Sacred seeing. Seeing that recognizes that everything, iron, wood, stone, even steel and concrete and aluminum, exists within larger web of meaning. Within sacred context that demands respect. The curse remains. Will remain. Teaching through each generation that discovers it. Each cursed descendant who feels pain upon touching iron. Each witness bearer who chooses to endure monthly rather than forget what needs remembering. It remains because we need it to remain. Because without it we would forget. Would reduce everything to material. Would lose the sacred dimension. Would repeat Marcus's error in new forms. Would break relationship we don't understand until breaking costs us everything. The curse is gift. Terrible gift. Painful gift. But gift nonetheless. Gift that teaches what cannot be taught any other way. That makes us remember what we're tempted to forget. That forces us to see what we'd rather ignore. Gift that transforms tragedy into wisdom. Loss into gain. Limitation into calling. Gift that shows us, generation after generation, that some things cannot be found. Can only be earned. Through sacrifice. Through suffering. Through willingness to pay costs we'd rather avoid. Just like love. Just like wisdom. Just like every genuine transformation. The curse teaches that the sacred is real. That boundaries exist for reasons. That relationship matters more than technique. That some things must be honored even when honoring them is hard. This is Folklore Crypt. And remember, not all curses are what they seem. Some are disguised blessings. Some are teachers we needed but didn't want. Some are invitations dressed as limitations. Some are doorways that only open one way, through acceptance rather than resistance. The Yoruba say, Ipati akomoninsei. The power we don't know is what shapes the world. The curse you carry might be the wisdom you're meant to share. The limitation you hate might be the calling you're meant to embrace. The pain you endure might be the teaching you're meant to pass forward. Not all iron can be worked, but all iron can teach. If we're willing to witness. If we're willing to learn. If we're willing to transform our relationship with limitation from resistance to acceptance. From curse to calling. From tragedy to gift. Before the fire went out. That's when the best stories were told. And now the fire is out. The story is told. The wisdom passed forward. May you recognize the sacred in the material. May you honor boundaries you don't fully understand. May you transform your curses into callings. May you see that some limitations are actually liberations in disguise. This is Folklore Crypt.